welcome to Power to Fly's chat and learn session today. My name is Greta Schmidt, and I am the manager of legal operations here at Power to Fly. And I am excited about today because we're going to be talking about pay transparency, an exciting topic. 2023 is said to be the year of pay transparency. And so I know you're all here wanting to learn, understand a little bit about what that means, what it means for your business, what it means for you as an individual. So we'll get started here now. I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping rules. So first of all, we want you to participate. So please turn on your camera and join in the fun. And you don't need to be like looking pretty or anything. Just join in and have a good time with us and send us your questions. I want you to know that we are recording. We will be sending this to an email after for everyone who signed up, and you will be getting notice of that. But we'd love to have you be a part of things today. The next thing is, feel free to write your questions in the chat. We really like having questions that come up now and things that are relative to what we're talking about. So once I have a chance to introduce our expert today, feel free to, if something pings in your brain, feel free to get a question to us. And then last but not least, please follow us on socials. We want to share all our resources with you. We want to be a source for you of expertise. And so please feel free to share resources. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Jill Langhals to you. Jill is the manager of compensation services for Employers Resource Association. And that's a membership-based nonprofit organization that helps keep companies current, compliant, and competent in human resource practices. Jill, would you like to share anything else about who you are before we start out with questions?
Sure, thanks, Greta.
No problem.
I'm excited to be here and joining Power to Fly. This is great. So yes, in my role, I work with our members who are primarily small to medium-sized organizations, and I help them with compensation education, market pricing, building pay structures, working through equity and transparency projects, creating bonus plans, and all sorts of things related to total rewards. Prior to that, I had close to 20 years of experience now in HR, primarily specializing in comp. I did a few stints as a generalist, but have always come back to compensation.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that you're here. Thank you so much for being with us. And we're going to keep this as conversational as possible, Jill. So, we'll just ping and pong with each other. So the first question I have, and we had people submit questions before this, is what exactly does pay transparency mean by definition?
Yeah, so pay transparency doesn't really have a precise definition. It's really more of a spectrum. So
Okay.
It starts with posting pay ranges on job openings. And then as you move further along the spectrum toward greater transparency, you would be sharing pay ranges internally with your employees and sharing information about where their pay falls within the range and why that is, what kind of market data you use and how you set pay ranges, what the other pay ranges in the organization are. And then at the fully transparent end of the spectrum, you would be sharing everyone's salaries as well. So it's also important to keep in mind that moving toward greater pay transparency, if you're starting at none, doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It will need to be a work in
progress.
It's a journey.
Yes.
Yeah, continuous improvement effort for a while as you work to put all of the proper policies and procedures and communication tools in place.
Okay, and are there standard steps in that process? If we have people that are just starting out this journey, do you have any kind of idea of the steps that it takes to get to total pay transparency?
Yes, so you really want to first have a good compensation philosophy and strategy in place and know what types of things you want to reward. So your compensable factors like education and experience, certifications maybe, and then you want to think about how transparent you want to be as well, because like I mentioned, it's a spectrum. So nailing down your compensation strategy and philosophy. And then you're going to want to make sure that you have a good foundational pay structure in place and have your jobs organized in pay ranges so that you can be able to compare them to each other and know what ranges to post. You're going to need good market data, at least two sources, ideally, more for being able to build that pay structure and know where you need to pay to be competitive with market. You're going to need good job descriptions so that you can benchmark to market appropriately and also help define how your jobs compare to each other so you can build your structure appropriately. And then once you get all of those foundational elements in place, you really need to think about your communication strategy and training your managers to communicate about pay so
Yes.
that when employees ask them, they can speak
Mhm.
knowledgeably about it.
Absolutely. That makes total sense. I liked what you said about the philosophy piece of it being at the beginning of what is your company's philosophy on pay transparency? And because Power to Fly has two audiences, we help employers, but we also help employees when you're looking for work, right? That's something that you want to be empowered to do is look at the pay transparency philosophy, see if it matches with your values. So I loved what you said there. So thank you for that.
Mhm.
So it's a nice transition into one of the questions that was submitted earlier, which is what does a pay transparency policy or philosophy say about a company's culture? Does it say anything?
Yeah, I think it definitely does.
Mhm,
Pay transparency is about open and honest communication and building trust.
mhm.
And so I think it also really shows that an organization cares about its employees and wants to pay them fairly. And so having a culture of trust and caring is going to go a long way in helping employees feel valued and like they're at a place they want to stay.
So you work in the real world, right? And so what's the fear of being transparent, right? Why haven't we done that historically? Why do we have to have regulation to have that happen? Why aren't we doing that? Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think there's a big fear about, am I competitive? Am I paying what's right? If I post my ranges, if I share with my employees what my ranges are, am I going to be able to retain them? And that brings me to an interesting statistic that I read. And that is a report from PayScale showed that over 80%, I believe it was 82% of employees said that they were satisfied with their pay so long as rationale was provided, even
I
if they
see.
were paid below the market average. So
Mhm.
employees really just want to know how they're paid, why that is, where you're coming up with this data, and if you can back that up, with your good philosophy and strategy and your sound data, then largely employees will be satisfied if you tell them the rationale behind their pay.
That's an interesting thought that even if they are paid below value, they are okay as long as it's thought through. And that's part of trust, isn't it? It's
Yes.
understanding a company culture, understanding why managers make decisions, why leaders make decisions. It's all about as being as transparent as possible. So,
Definitely.
all right. So how can companies best prepare for the implementation of a pay transparency policy?
So I think going back to having all of those foundational elements in place
Yep.
is
Mhm.
really important. And then the communication piece, I mentioned a little bit too, that's essential. So thinking a little bit more about that, you know, you really want to make sure you have all your ducks in a row, make any adjustments, pay adjustments that are necessary to make pay equitable ahead of time before you roll out full-on transparency in terms of
Mhm.
ranges and things.
Yeah,
So make those adjustments and then talk
yeah.
to your employees about what your strategy is, how you've arrived at their pay, where
Mhm.
they're positioned in the range. And then you want to train managers also to talk to them when they have performance reviews about what what their mobility is. So where can they move within the range? What are other pay ranges that they may be able to move into if they were to take a different job? And then also considering um, where they fall within their range and why that is if performance is an issue, and using that to help motivate employees. And then also communicating when you roll out a program in short bursts and in a way that your employees can understand, because we all know that the human attention span is very short, and while people do want this information, it's difficult for some to consume it in large quantities. So short
Sure.
bursts of information, videos if you can. People love
Mhm.
video communication, and making it so that your employees can understand.
Okay, well, we're getting some questions in, Jill, so I appreciate, first of all, I want to say thanks for your expertise, but also to the audience, thanks for sending us your questions. I love doing live questions. So one of the questions is, are posted ranges meant to be total rewards, total direct compensation, including equity, total cash, or is this just base salary? And I think that there is probably a legal answer to that. And then there is what do you want your company philosophy to be? So,
Yes. So right now, to my knowledge, Colorado is the only state that does require some posting regarding total comp and benefits.
yeah.
All of the other regulations are more around base pay. And
Mhm.
so that does bring up an interesting question. I think it would be important to call that out in a posting and say, this is the base salary, the range is, X to Y, and then highlight all of your other benefits and perks that set your
Mhm.
organization apart.
Mhm.
I've also heard recently that more employers are doing offer letters that look like total reward statements. So
Mhm.
really emphasizing this is your base pay offer, and then this is what all of your benefits are worth, and this is what all of your
Mhm.
time off is worth, and all of the other company perks that may add value, making sure that employers or candidates see all of that on the offer.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that we're starting to see that model. And that really, that is something that, again, those people that are looking for work can look for in a company. It's an indicator of health, right? It's an indicator of a healthy company. So
Definitely.
yeah. One more question we have is what is the best way to approach an analysis on pay equity between, let's say, genders or races in your organization?
So that depends on your philosophy, of course.
Hmm.
You're going to want to define what your compensable factors are. So, are you rewarding for education? Are you rewarding for certification? Are you rewarding for performance? Because those are things that are, of course, going to affect people's pay if those are what you've been rewarding for in the past.
Hmm.
So you can start by doing just sort of a large overall unadjusted analysis to see
Hmm.
where females versus males fall and where minorities versus non-minorities fall in terms of pay differences. And then you do want to factor in some of those compensable factors to get more of a true picture of
Hmm.
where you're at. Um, Unless, of course, then we're sort of getting into the larger picture of complete pay equity and thinking about, well, are females in jobs that typically pay lower in the market. And that's why, so even though they're paid equitably for their role, is their
Mhm.
role paid equitably compared to more male dominated roles? Because there have been studies that show, as more women move into a typically male dominated field, the
Yep.
pay for those jobs decreases.
Mhm.
And so that gets sort of into what is your philosophy and what does pay equity really mean to you?
Absolutely, absolutely. And when when you break it down with education performance, it's really an interesting area that we need to examine, because I think there are, performance is one thing, right? But all of the other factors that go in, and years of experience. I know a lot of women, right, and myself included, took a break for a while for having children, right? So that cut into my years of experience. And so it's really interesting to think of the factors that are out there. And could you list those types of factors for us? Do you have like a spreadsheet in your mind at all of the factors that people use in those situations?
So it's generally easiest to think about what are you considering when you're making an offer for a new hire. So it's typically going to be, obviously what is the job, and where does that fall in your pay structure, or if you don't have a pay structure, where does it fall in comparison to how you value the other roles in your organization?
Mhm.
Um, what is the education required for the job? What is the level of experience required? So maybe not, maybe you don't want to factor in all experience completely, but does the person at least meet the minimum requirements of the experience to do the job? Certification.
And a lot of
So
companies aren't requiring education as an indicator anymore, as I understand. I think they're moving to a model of more experience based as opposed to education based, which will minimize the pay gap a bit.
yes, yeah, exactly. So it's really important to think about, and that goes back to having your job descriptions well defined and well written. What does it really take to do that job? Does
Yep.
the job require a bachelor's degree, or can
Hmm.
somebody, get that body of knowledge just by doing the work for 5 years?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Want to answer one question that came up. Yes, they asked if we could share the evidence about pay decreasing for roles as more women enter historically male dominated roles. We can look it up, and I'm sure, and Jill's probably referencing just something that she read somewhere, but we can look it up and we will try to share it with you, certainly.
Yes, I
All
know
right,
I've
well,
read about multiple research studies that show that. I just don't have their location in my mind right now.
that's okay. We don't require that kind of knowledge, Jill. That kind of recall goes away at a certain age, right?
Right.
All right. How do you factor in the existing employees? This is a question that is really interesting, right? Because it's one thing to provide salary ranges for new employees, but let's talk about existing employees, and how do these new laws that are coming forward really like give them a little bit more insight into what's happening, even if they've been there for a while.
Yeah, so this is a reason that I would really encourage people to be um, forward thinking and try to implement some levels of pay transparency before it's required by law in your area. Because we know that more and more legislation is coming out every month, it seems like. And
Hmm.
so if you get into a position where you are required to post ranges before you've done the work internally, you're
Hmm.
probably going to have some upset employees, understandably.
Hmm.
Um, so ideally, you want to do the work ahead of time, establish all of your compensation strategies and procedures and policies, and give any pay adjustments that are necessary to fix internal equity issues and
Hmm.
market equity issues for your current employees before you're posting ranges publicly or even internally. Um, and then, if you do get in a situation where you have to post the ranges because you're required by law and you haven't gotten things squared away internally yet, then you just want to be open and honest with your employees and let them know what you're doing to work toward better equity and transparency, and that it's, work in progress. It'll take some time, but you do have every intention of getting there and paying everyone fairly.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question. So do you have to adjust if they don't ask? Or do they have to ask and then you adjust? How, from an HR perspective, right? And again, it goes to the philosophy of the company on pay transparency, but what are you seeing in the marketplace? How are you seeing people handle that?
So really, to build that culture of trust and be an employer of choice, I'm seeing most organizations want to make those pay adjustments proactively, and doing the right thing to make pay equitable before they get in a situation where employees are upset and complaining.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's nice to hear that that's happening out there.
Yeah.
So one question that just came up, and it kind of goes to, and I know that you work mostly and primarily in the US, but I think it's worthy of asking the question. We at Power to Fly are working through these issues right now. What if you have employees that are based in European countries, or we're talking about a global marketplace? How are you seeing companies handle pay transparency when you have, different locations involved?
So, I guess thinking of it is, more, this question is it more philosophical or more strategical. But so a lot of European countries already have more progressive pay transparency requirements than what the US does. So it's likely that maybe this is more of a strategy related question. And so, for your different geographical locations that have differences in cost of living and cost of employment, you're going to want different pay structures so that it's easier to make sure people are paid equitably, based on where they sit and where they live.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and I think communication is key there too, right? Is helping people understand that a New York-based salary, for instance, is going to be much different than a salary from a small European country. So
Definitely.
so helping people understand that you are posting salary ranges based on location.
Yes. And if you
I,
happen to post a job that, could be done remotely from literally anywhere,
yeah.
it's a good idea to put on there, okay, this is the range, the reasonable pay range for X location.
That's
This
right.
could vary based on where the chosen employee resides. If you have the capability, if you have it already determined, and you want to post various ranges, I've heard about organizations posting, maybe 3 or 4 very prominent locations to give an idea of what the range would be for, say, a New York market and a Chicago market, and then maybe a large European country market, and then a small European country market. Post a few different ranges to give people an idea, but definitely state in the posting, that it could vary based on geographic location.
Okay. And we have a question here from Jake. In the US, do you see most companies taking an approach to pay people based on where they live or based on where the company is based when talking about jobs that can be done remotely?
That is still evolving.
It is.
I'm not really seeing one hard and fast approach yet. I think it depends a lot on where your people are working and how competitive you want to be. So, really pay is determined based on what the organization needs to hire, right? And so if you are looking to hire a very specific, highly specialized technical person, and you don't think that you can get that type of person, say, for example, in Columbus, Ohio, where I live, we're pretty much on par with the national wages and national cost of living. If you don't think you can get that here, then you're probably going to want to look at targeting pay more at like a San Francisco market.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So another question along these lines, a little more practical, is what are the best resources available for benchmarking and best practices for equitable pay? Do you have any suggestions for resources?
I have tons of suggestions.
Mhm.
It depends a lot on your industry. And so certain salary surveys are more geared towards certain industries. So if you can
Mhm.
find an industry specific one, that's helpful. I think a lot of these survey database pricing tools that are out now are
Mhm.
really helpful in aggregating data and making it so that you don't have to purchase multiple surveys and try to figure out
Yeah.
which one is the best match. And so I really like a lot of those, the database pricing tools.
Awesome. Yeah. Dolores is asking a question I think is really interesting. How do you address pay structures for varying experience levels with employees that are doing similar jobs? So employee A has 3 years of experience and employee B, 15 years of experience, but they have similar job titles. How would you address that situation?
So you need to think about the work being done, and should employee B, who has 15 years of experience, really be in a higher level job? Are they working at a
Mhm.
higher level? Are they mentoring the lesser experienced employees? Are they working more independently? If so, you're going to want to create a separate job title for them and put them in a different pay range, most likely, because the market is going to command a higher rate for that level of experience and work as well. Now, if you just have somebody who enjoys hanging out in the position that they like and
Mhm.
have been in for a
Mhm.
long time, but they're working at the same level as somebody who has 3 years of experience, then that's where you need to start thinking about, you can differentiate their pay to some degree by paying them higher in the pay range.
Mhm.
But then at some point, they are probably going to max out. And if you're enforcing pay range maximums so that you can have internal equity, then you have to think about other ways to reward that person. So if you're happy with the work they're doing and they're happy staying in that job and they don't want to move to a higher level job, then you can reward them with retention bonuses. You could offer maybe a premium pay, just for the
Mhm.
time they spend mentoring or training other employees if they're doing that. So getting creative with other ways to reward them that doesn't involve continually increasing their base pay.
Okay. Awesome. That makes sense. Makes sense. We have to think outside the box for situations like that.
Yeah.
Getting a lot of questions. I'm trying to read through them and listen at the same time. So please understand that I'm hearing you and I'm also reading a little bit. Um, so returning to an earlier question, and I wanted to come back to that because I think somebody's asking, do you have examples of database pricing tools that you could throw out there?
I didn't know if I was allowed to name names or anything, but
I think it's okay. Yeah.
ones I've worked with before and like are market pay factors to the pay scale suite of products. I haven't used it, but I've heard some good things about Comp Analyst, which is salary.com's survey pricing tool.
Mhm. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. So I'm going to go to one of the pre-written questions and then I'll return to some of the ones that are coming up. But so there's a question here of, I work at a very small pro-worker nonprofit that is in the very beginning stages of drafting an equitable compensation policy. Do you have any recommendations for how do you benchmark salaries to similar organizations when you're working with something like that's so out of the box?
Yes. So depending on what type of nonprofit you are, there could be an industry specific survey that you can use. I know, for example, I've worked with a couple of food banks before, and they roll up to a larger organization called Feeding America. And that organization puts out a salary survey every year. And so they utilize that. So look into, if you are in a nonprofit industry that maybe has an association that puts out a salary survey, that could be helpful. The Nonprofit Times has a fairly inexpensive salary survey.
Mhm.
Of course, there's 990 data that you can look up, but that's only going to show information for the 5 highest paid jobs in each organization.
Mhm.
But also, I would encourage you to think about your comp philosophy, and if you want to pay competitively with the rest of the market and not just nonprofits. So we know that nonprofits largely lag the market in pay, but people are sometimes motivated to still work there because of the mission of the organization.
Mhm.
But I would say if you're struggling to attract people, you'll probably want to look at data, so maybe using like those pricing tools that I mentioned before, where you can set your pay market differently. So you could look at what would this job pay if it were just for nonprofit industries, or what would it pay in for-profit industries? And then you
Mhm.
can decide, how competitive do I need to be? Do I need to pay more at the for-profit level if I'm having trouble recruiting?
Mhm.
And then also, if you're a small organization, it can get expensive to buy surveys and pricing tools,
Mhm.
and it can get time consuming if you're, the sole HR person. And so, I would also encourage you to reach out to your local employers association.
Mhm.
So employers associations, that's the branch that I work for. There are organizations all over the U.S., and that's really what we specialize in, is helping smaller organizations at a more affordable price and giving them, being an extension of their HR department.
Awesome. That's great advice, I think. And I think there's a lot of people in that situation. So, um, okay. So, is there any value in your opinion in posting ranges versus flat non-negotiable salaries? Let's say you're not required by law to do it, right? What would you say are the advantages of posting ranges versus flat?
I would say the primary advantage is going to be the potential to draw more candidates. If you just post one
Hmm.
flat amount, you might be excluding some people who are, maybe looking for a little bit higher, and maybe you would be willing to pay that. Maybe it's just a difference of $5,000, which might not mean a lot to your organization, but could mean a lot to the person looking at the job. So a
Hmm.
range gives you some flexibility to be able to look at more experienced candidates, and then also lesser experienced candidates who, you may not have to pay as much because they're looking to gain experience.
Yeah, no, it's really about attraction, right? It's about letting people know that you're not just, you're willing to negotiate, you're willing to
Right.
talk through things, you're willing to see value outside the box. And really that's the communication that takes place when you see a salary range versus just a flat salary. So now, what steps would you advise a company to take to decide whether to post salary ranges to comply with the current incoming US regulation, or to post salary ranges on a broader scale outside of regulation being required? So I think the question is really, like, how do we decide as a company? Okay, we know California's law is coming out in January, so we know in California we have to do a certain thing, but do we have to do it, in Texas, or do we have to do it somewhere else? How do we figure that out, and where is that? I think that's a journey question, really. And it depends on where people are at in the journey, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, so definitely a journey and philosophy question. I would say, you know, um, the climate that we're in right now with the increase in legislation around pay transparency and being a very tight labor market where more employees are demanding pay transparency, I don't think this is something that is going away anytime
Mm-mm,
soon. And
mm-mm.
so I would say if
Yeah.
you have the resources to do it now, do it now. Be
Mhm.
proactive. don't wait until you're required by law. Get everything straightened out now so that you can say, hey, look, we're doing this to be an employer of choice. We care about paying our employees fairly. We want you to know what you're paid, how you're paid. So while it's only required in our California location, we're rolling this out for our entire organization.
Absolutely. I've read a number of articles here, and I think that it is, there is talk of federal legislation here. So the more that you can be proactive now, and start down that journey and look at it from a global, or at least across the US perspective, I really think that you're getting yourself ahead of the game, as opposed to having to like, oh, okay, now this other state dropped a new law, we have to catch up. So
Yeah.
always best to be proactive, and you're right, it's not going anywhere. So how do you view leveraging signing bonuses to help keep base salaries relatively level, but landing candidates? Is it inequitable as only some people receive the bonus, though their salary will be the same?
So I think right now in our current climate, it's a good idea and something that you're probably going to need to leverage. And I don't think it's necessarily inequitable, because if you consider the fact that, right now, a lot of people are struggling to hire because there are 1.7 job openings for every one person. You have to get candidates somehow. But let's say 9 months from now, we maybe go into a recession, things slow down, the labor market really cools. You don't want to be offering people, base salaries that are $20,000 higher than your current employees, because then you have to keep paying that, even if the market slows down. So while I don't always love temporary short-term bonuses, because, as like a Band-Aid, because that never really fixes the problem, I do think that things like sign-on bonuses and or retention bonuses right now are appropriate given the current climate, so that you don't throw your base pay equity too far out of whack, but you are still able to keep hiring and retaining employees.
That's an interesting topic, isn't it? And it really comes down to negotiation skills too. So it's an interesting area. Traditionally, there has been different negotiation ability and people asking for signing bonuses. So it creates inequity, but it keeps equity, I guess, on the side of the salary piece of things, correct?
Yeah. And you're right, that, that is a tough call. Another thing you could look at, instead of just calling it a signing bonus, that if someone negotiates for it, maybe you want to offer a hot jobs premium or a skills premium to recruit those hard to find skills, and you're going to give that to anyone who comes in the door right now, and it's going to be a certain amount regardless of whether
They
they're
negotiate
male or
or
female,
don't
and they negotiate.
negotiate. Yeah, no, I like that idea. I think that makes for a more equitable situation, I think.
Yes.
All right. Let's see. We have a lot of questions coming in, and I love that, but I'm going to go back to the ones that were earlier submitted, just to make sure that we cover the things that for the people who got in early. So how are businesses without defined salary scales approaching this topic?
That's a good question, because I know there are some organizations that just haven't had time to do the work to be competitive yet in this transparency space. So I would say if you're a very small organization, or you're not required by law yet, then hold off and do the work first of setting up the structure and the philosophy, so that you can have things in an orderly fashion to be able to post ranges. If you're not in that position, then I would say, look at, you could do something like plus or minus 10 to 20% of what the budgeted amount is for the role, because most managers are going to have a number in mind that they know they're going to need to pay to fill a position. So you can create a range based around that budgeted amount. You could also look at,
Mhm.
if you already have an employee or two doing the same type of work, then I would suggest building your range around what those current employees are making so that you're not creating internal equity problems for yourself when you go to hire. So, maybe um, take the lowest paid employee and the highest paid employee that are in that job category, and then, add 10% on each end. Or if you don't have anyone currently in the exact same type of job, look at how you value your other jobs internally. So what are people making in a job that would be paid a little bit lower than this new role you have to post? And then what are people being paid in a job that's maybe a level higher? And use that to build a range to be able to post for your new opening.
Yeah, I like that advice. Even if you're not required, a lot of companies are under in some of the states that are requiring pay transparency. Maybe they're just a very small company, right? And they're not required to do it. Getting the work done first before you start doing it is just, I think it's wise counsel. So one question that came up here, and I think this is a great one, is do you have to share current employees' salaries with the new laws, or is it only a law to post salary ranges for new employees on job postings?
So I will let you speak to this and correct me if I'm wrong, since you are the employment law attorney. But to my knowledge, there is nothing requiring anyone to share salaries yet. I believe Illinois is going to be requiring employers to submit data on employees' pay at some point in 2023, but then they will only report that in the aggregate. Is that your understanding as well?
So my understanding, and I don't have the best recall, but I've done a lot of reading on the subject, is upon request, they do need to. So in a lot of the laws, upon request, they have to provide it, but it's not something that you proactively have to do. So,
Okay.
yeah, so that's basically, but I think the idea there is, why would you want to wait until they request it, in my view? Or why would you want to not be prepared if they do request it, right?
Yes.
So, so a lot of companies are getting this work done very, very, they're getting it done ahead of time. They know. Drew, so just to answer your question there, by the employee. So if the employee requests it, thanks for making me clarify. If the employee requests it, then they do need to post it to them. Yeah, they need to let them know the ranges within their salary title. So, all right, let's go on to, I like this question. We've got about 15 minutes left here, and I think that this is a really great question. How can we get the conversation started around pay transparency at the workplace? As a member of the HR department, could you share some advice for us for how to get leadership's buy-in to pay transparency, right? Because if you don't own the philosophy of the company, how do you help your company change its philosophy?
Yes, very good question. And so there are several things to think about here. So number one, I would share with your leadership that this is what employees and job seekers want. People want to understand how they're paid. Like I mentioned before, it can go a long way in helping you retain employees, even if you can't be completely competitive with market, as long as you explain how they're paid and why that is. Then, of course, you want to talk about all of the benefits of building a trusting culture and a culture of caring, and that's going to help you retain people as well. And then think about there are a lot of people now, especially the younger generation, that prioritize working for an organization that wants to do the right thing and is working on DEI and ESG initiatives. And so doing this work to be more transparent about pay is going to contribute to better pay equity and helping to close those pay gaps, So it's really going to help make you an employer of choice and be competitive in the market. So I would just emphasize all the benefits, and then if they still aren't getting it, then talk about how it could cause you to not be able to retain and then not be able to compete and hire. And that's a slippery slope that you don't want to go down.
Yeah, I think that first of all, there's you need to change their philosophy by helping it help them, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's sales, right? It's helping helping them see how pay transparency is going to benefit them. And then next, there's also the legal trends, right? So we're seeing pay transparency laws in a lot of states. You can help them understand the benefit of getting ahead of that and all that goes into that. So, and then I also have a question here, and I really like this one, which is, what really goes into a pay philosophy? So, for example, Liz, our ranges are 9 years old, she says. So, right, like, okay, so they have the ranges, but they're not up to date. And so how do we show that the philosophy is, what makes for a good and solid philosophy on pay transparency?
So thinking about how you want to position yourself in the market, what how you want to reward employees. So again, the things you want to reward for, who your market comparators are, who you want to compete with. Do you want to say you're a mid-sized company, do you want to compete with the largest employers in your organization, or are you going to say, okay, well, we're going to compare to like size employers? And then thinking about where you want to be in terms of pay transparency. Do you want to be fully transparent where you're publishing your ranges and everyone's salaries for your entire organization? Or do you want to say, we're going to share the ranges, we're going to share the pay range for the job that an employee's in, and then maybe the range below and above it. Things like that. So thinking about where you want to fall on that pay transparency spectrum, what types of things you want to reward for, who you're going to compete with, and then thinking too about, this goes into a little bit more of the strategy so much as philosophy. How frequently are you going to update those pay ranges, right? We know that 9 years is no longer competitive, and I feel your pain. I've worked in plenty of organizations where the pay ranges were outdated, and it makes it difficult then when you have to hire a lot of people to be able to do that competitively and quickly. And so have a strategy on, okay, we're going to age the ranges for a year or two, and then we're going to do a full market review every 3 years and update the pay structure. Or maybe we're going to look at 10 key benchmark jobs each year and get updated data and refresh the structure that way.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Just understanding that this is an ongoing thing, right? So our market is changing, and it's changing all the time. And certainly right now we're seeing a shift in the marketplace. So 9 years is really going to look to an employee, as a job seeker, like that doesn't make much sense. And that's really not a philosophy. That's not consistent with the philosophy of true pay transparency. So, helping to make sure that everything is updated. And how often would you suggest updating? Do you have an idea of what the market's saying right now?
So yeah, it definitely depends on the market. Right now, you're probably going to want to, update your structure at least by aging it, by I would say at minimum the current merit awards that you're giving every year. Ideally, though, because the market's changing so fast, it would be a good idea to pull fresh market data for at least your key benchmark jobs every year, until things start to slow down. It used to be that you could get away with aging the structure for, 2-3 years, or
Mhm.
just, just by that consistent
Mhm.
2% merit increase every year. And then
Not
maybe you look
anymore.
at your jobs and update, every
Yep.
third or fourth year, but we're not there anymore.
No, no, we're not. Yeah. All right, so we have a good question, and I call it a rubber meets the road question, right? So we're talking about one salary. Talking about one salary has always been taboo and discouraged among staff, right? This is new. It's uncomfortable for a lot of people. Just want to acknowledge that. How do you address the transition and manage employee expectations or even dissatisfaction and feelings that a coworker is at a higher end and they are at the lower end of the scale? And how do you remedy that situation? Because that's truly going to happen. And I think thinking through how you're going to manage it before it does is going to benefit everyone.
Yes. Yeah. So like I mentioned before, if there's a reason, or if there's not a good reason that there's a pay discrepancy, then fix it. Make an adjustment for that person who is going to be upset because they're paid lower. If there is a good reason for it, then that's where your communication comes in, and it's really important to explain to your employees what the factors are that you consider and why they're paid at this position in the range, but somebody else may be paid at a higher position in the range. And then another really important piece is to give them some encouragement and talk to them about how they can progress through the pay range, what things they need to do to either, improve their performance, or maybe it's just about timing. Maybe it's just about, well, they need to gain some more experience in doing the work, or maybe it's picking up a new certification, or attending a class and getting a credential, and that could move them further. So talk about how they can increase their pay if that's what they want to do.
No, that makes total sense. And it is a reality that's really going to impact, it's going to be there. So think it through, have a plan. And a lot of times, I always mix my metaphors, but an ounce of prevention saves harm. Is that how it goes? So,
Or something about a cure. I'm not sure about that one either. Something like that.
I make up metaphors. That's kind of my MO. So, all right. So let's get to one last question, and then Jill, I'll give you some time to talk a little bit about your organization and things like that. So, let's talk. And this has come up a lot: is best practices for implementing a pay transparency policy. And I just, I think it's worth hitting it again, step by step, so people walk away from this with solid information on what their steps should be. So can you help me? Can you articulate them? And if we have we can, I wish we had a document that we could give people, but we don't. So is there a step guide that you can give for people?
Sure. So step one is going to be nailing down that compensation philosophy and strategy. How do you want to pay people? What do you want to compensate for? Who are you going to compete with? And then, making sure your job descriptions are in good order so that you can really figure out how your jobs compare to one another. Having at least 2 good sources of market data so that you can see what the market should pay for your jobs, and use that as a factor, not necessarily a hard and fast, but a factor.
That's benchmarking, correct? You would say
Correct.
that's benchmarking?
Yep,
Okay.
benchmarking. And then you're going to want to use those job descriptions and that benchmarking data in conjunction with one another to create a pay structure. So you're, there are different ways of doing that. I think it's really a good idea to do a combination of a market database structure and a, sort of an internal comparison factors basis for the structure, so that, because we know that there are just some jobs that are paid lower in the market for historical reasons. but those jobs may be vital to your organization and what your organization does. And so you are going to want to prioritize those and put them potentially in a higher pay range than what the market warrants because of how they compare to other jobs in your organization. And then once you have that structure built, then you want to examine your how your current employees fall within those pay ranges and make any necessary adjustments. So that's going to go, back to thinking through your compensation strategy and how do you want to pay people in the range? If somebody has 5 years of experience, do you want them to be at the midpoint of the range? Or maybe you want them to be at the midpoint of the range after 2 years because you want to be very competitive with market. So look at that and see what adjustments you may need to make. And then once you've got all of that, then really think about how you want to communicate and roll this out, and have multiple meetings, multiple methods of communication. Train your managers to be able to talk to employees about pay when they ask about it, so that your managers understand that comp strategy as well and can answer why X employee is paid lower than Y employee.
This is really a challenge, I think, for managers these days because, it's an uncomfortable topic, right? And so they really need to be educated.
The uncomfortable topic thing is, I think that's going to change. I think it's only an uncomfortable topic because old societal rules made it that way. And also because maybe some employers weren't being fair about pay and didn't want employees to know. But I think that all of this pay transparency legislation coming out and more and more employers wanting to be proactive and get on the pay transparency spectrum and communicate more about pay, as long as you have your strategy nailed down and you can explain why people are paid the way they are, then I don't think it has to be taboo. I think, if you are paying fairly, then there shouldn't be a problem.
Yes, it seems to me that it's the ones that know they have a problem, right, and haven't dealt with it, that are going to be the most uncomfortable. But if you do that work, right, and you get to equity, you really shouldn't be uncomfortable. So Jill, I'm going to leave the last minutes to you, and just say simply, tell us about what you do if people want to reach out and you can provide some services. Maybe it would be a time for you to reach out and be able to do that.
Sure, thanks. So yeah, as I mentioned, I work for Employers Resource Association, which is a regional chapter of the larger Employers Associations of America. And so, I can help you with things like building your salary structure, getting market data for you, helping to do an equity analysis, making recommendations for pay, things like that. So there are different employers associations throughout the US. And so maybe you have one that is closer to you geographically, and that might be helpful for you as well. So if you look for Employers Associations of America, you can find your nearest location. Not all locations offer compensation services, though. I know the one that's here in Cleveland doesn't offer compensation services. So the people who are up near Cleveland come to me for that type of work. But really, I can provide data and help you with pretty much anything US-based pay.
Awesome, Jill. Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. We're coming up on the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody who has joined us. Jill, how do they reach you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Jill Langhals. You can also email me at my first initial last name. So that will be JLanghals at ERAHR.org. And now, as I'm saying all of that, I realize I could just type it in the chat and that would be much easier.
That's okay.
Let me do that.
That's okay. Well,
what's actually copy down. There we go. All right.
There we go. We'll get there. All right, well, thanks, everybody. Let's hope that this was helpful and gave some people some direction. And I'm excited about pay transparency. I think it's a great change in our culture, and you know, transparency builds trust. I'll just leave it with that. Thanks so much.
Thank you.